My brother found our crawl space holding children's teeth in a jar and screamed, "I thought you said you never had kids." The glass jar slipped from Liam's hands and shattered across the concrete floor of my crawl space, 23 tiny teeth scattering like seeds across the dusty ground. My brother stood there frozen in the dim light from his headlamp, staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure horror, mixed with something worse. Accusation. I'd bought this house 6 months ago, a 1940s craftsman in northeast Portland that needed work, but had good bones. Liam had come over to help me install new insulation in the crawl space, a project we'd planned for weeks. We'd been down there for maybe 20 minutes, pulling out old fiberglass and vapor barriers, when he'd reached into a gap between floor joists and pulled out the jar. It had been wrapped in oilcloth, hidden deliberately in a space you'd only find if you were doing serious renovation work. Inside were teeth. Small teeth. Baby teeth, and what looked like permanent teeth from young children. 23 of them, some with roots still attached, some with what looked like old blood staining the enamel brown. Liam had shouted my name, had held up the jar asking what the hell it was, and when I'd said I had no idea, had never seen it before, he'd screamed that question that made my stomach drop through the floor. "I thought you said you never had kids." Like he thought these were teeth I'd pulled from my own children. Children I'd never mentioned. Children whose teeth I'd hidden in my crawl space like some kind of trophy collection. I'd been living in this house for 6 months, working as a systems analyst for a tech company downtown. The house had been a foreclosure, sold by the bank after the previous owner had defaulted and disappeared. The listing had mentioned the owner had lived here for 15 years before vanishing, leaving everything behind. I'd gotten it for below market value because it needed so much work. Updated electrical, new plumbing, insulation, flooring. I'd been slowly renovating it room by room, doing what I could myself, and hiring contractors for the major stuff. Liam had been helping me with projects most weekends. He was a contractor by trade, knew houses inside and out, was good with his hands and patient with teaching me. We'd been close our whole lives despite the 6-year age gap. He was 42 to my 36, married with 2 kids of his own, Lily who was 8, and Connor who was 6. The fact that he had young children made his horror at finding the teeth even more visceral. I could see him thinking about his own kids, about what kind of monster would collect children's teeth, about whether his brother could be that kind of monster. I tried to explain that the house had been owned by someone else, that I'd never seen the jar before, that we needed to call the police. He'd backed away from me, had pulled out his phone, had said he was calling them himself because he didn't trust me to do it. The first responding officers arrived within 15 minutes. Liam had apparently told the dispatcher he'd found evidence of possible child abuse or worse, had given them my address, had made it sound urgent. Officers Rachel Simmons and David Lloyd came down into the crawl space with flashlights and evidence bags, looking at the scattered teeth with professional detachment that somehow made it worse. Officer Simmons was maybe 35, had been with Portland PD for 8 years, according to what she told us later. Officer Lloyd was older, 50 or so, moved with the careful precision of someone who'd seen terrible things and learned not to react. They photographed everything, bagged the teeth individually, searched the rest of the crawl space for additional evidence, found nothing else hidden in the joists, but the teeth were enough. Simmons asked me directly how long I'd lived here. I said 6 months. She asked if I had children. I said no. She asked if I'd known the previous owner. I said no, that the house was a foreclosure I'd bought from the bank. She wrote all of this down without expression. Lloyd asked if I'd consent to a search of the rest of the house. I said yes immediately, desperately wanting them to see I had nothing to hide. Liam stood in the corner of my living room while they searched, watching me like I was a stranger, not calling his wife who was expecting him home, just standing there radiating suspicion. The search of my house took 2 hours. They went through everything, my bedroom, my office, my garage, looking for anything that would connect me to the teeth or suggest I had children I'd never mentioned. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. I'd lived here alone since buying it, had no kids, had barely unpacked half my boxes from the move. The house was clearly bachelor chaos, mismatched furniture, renovation supplies everywhere, nothing that suggested children had ever lived here during my time. But that didn't explain the teeth. Officer Simmons asked about the previous owner. I told her what little I knew from the real estate listing. His name had been Walter Kemp. He'd bought the house in 2003 and lived here until 2018 when he'd stopped making mortgage payments and eventually disappeared. The bank had foreclosed, sold it at auction to a flipper who'd done minimal cosmetic work, then I'd bought it. I'd never met Walter Kemp, didn't know anything about him except he'd left a lot of junk in the basement and garage that I'd been slowly clearing out. Simmons asked if any of that junk had involved children's items. I thought about it. Said yes, actually. There had been some old toys and books in boxes in the basement. I'd donated them to Goodwill without thinking much about it. She asked if I still had photos of those items. I didn't. She said they'd need to contact the bank and previous owners, trace the chain of title, figure out when those teeth were hidden and by whom. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. Detectives arrived around 8 that evening. Franklin Bowman and Melissa Curtis, both from the Major Crimes Division. Bowman was mid-50s, African-American, built like a linebacker but moved quietly. Curtis was early 40s, red hair pulled back tight, eyes that missed nothing. They separated me from Liam, took statements individually, asked me the same questions the officers had asked but in more detail. About how I'd found the house, why I'd chosen it, whether I'd noticed anything odd during the purchase process. I explained it had been a good deal in a neighborhood I wanted, that the inspection had noted needed repairs but nothing alarming, that I'd been renovating steadily since moving in. Curtis asked if I'd found anything else disturbing during renovations. I said no, just the usual old house stuff, outdated fixtures, knob and tube wiring, mice droppings, nothing that suggested criminal activity. Bowman asked if anyone else had access to my crawl space. I said no, I'd been the only one down there until today with Liam. He asked if I'd noticed the gap in the floor joists where the jar had been hidden. I said I hadn't been doing detailed inspection, had just been pulling out old insulation. He wrote everything down in a worn leather notebook, expression neutral. They asked about my personal life, whether I was married, had ever been married, had children, spent time around children. I told them the truth. Never married, no kids, limited contact with children except my niece and nephew when visiting Liam's family. They asked about my work, my friends, my hobbies. Standard background stuff that felt invasive, but I answered everything honestly, because refusing would make me look guilty. Curtis asked if I'd submit to a polygraph. I said yes if they thought it would help, though I knew polygraphs weren't admissible in court, and their main purpose was to pressure suspects into confessing. I had nothing to confess. Bowman asked if I'd provide DNA and fingerprints for elimination purposes. I agreed to that too. They took samples right there, swabbed my cheek and inked my fingers, added my prints to their evidence file. The whole time, Liam sat in my kitchen looking at me like he didn't know me, like 36 years of brotherhood had been erased by one jar of teeth. When the detectives finally left around 10, saying they'd be in touch as the investigation progressed, Liam stood up to leave too. I asked him if he believed me that I'd never seen those teeth before. He said he didn't know what to believe, that he needed time to process this. He left without saying goodbye. I didn't sleep that night. Kept thinking about those teeth scattered across my crawlspace floor, about what they represented. 23 teeth. From how many children? Why had someone collected them? The most innocent explanation would be that Walter Kemp had saved his own children's baby teeth as sentimental keepsakes, something parents did. But that didn't explain the permanent teeth, or the ones with blood still on them, or the fact that they'd been hidden deliberately rather than kept in a memory box. The implications were horrifying. Either Walter Kemp had harmed children and kept their teeth as trophies, or something else equally disturbing had happened in this house before I'd bought it. I started researching. Found Walter Kemp's name in property records going back to 2003. Found an old Facebook profile that hadn't been updated since 2017. Profile picture showed a man in his 50s, average looking, nothing distinctive. No posts about children, no family photos. I searched for news articles about missing children in Portland during the years Kemp had lived here. Found dozens of cases going back decades. Oregon had a disturbing number of missing children cases, many unsolved. I looked for patterns, for cases from neighborhoods near mine, for disappearances that aligned with when Kemp lived here. Found 3 that seemed potentially relevant. A 6-year-old girl who'd vanished from a park in 2009, an 8-year-old boy who'd disappeared walking home from school in 2012, a 7-year-old girl who'd gone missing from her yard in 2015. All within 5 miles of my house. All unsolved. By morning I was exhausted and paranoid. Jumped at every sound, kept looking at my crawlspace access like it might reveal more horrors. My phone buzzed constantly. Texts from friends who'd somehow heard about police at my house. Calls from my mother asking what was going on. I ignored most of it. Around 9, Detective Curtis called. Said they'd sent the teeth for forensic analysis, DNA testing, and age determination. Said they were researching Walter Kemp's background, trying to locate him, checking missing persons databases. Said I should expect more questions as the investigation developed. She asked if I had a lawyer. I said I hadn't thought I needed one since I wasn't guilty of anything. She said it might be wise to consult one anyway, that investigations sometimes went in unexpected directions. I heard the warning in her voice. Thanked her and called a criminal defense attorney my friend had recommended once. Lawrence Briggs, 40 years of practice, reputation for being aggressive and smart. His secretary said he could see me that afternoon. I took emergency PTO from work. Couldn't imagine sitting in my office pretending to analyze data systems while this investigation was happening. Met with Briggs at 2. He was exactly what I'd expected. 60-something, expensive suit, office full of law books and golf trophies. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, took notes, asked a few clarifying questions. When I finished, he said the good news was I clearly hadn't hidden those teeth myself given the timeline. The bad news was, until police determined who had hidden them and why, I'd be under suspicion because it was my house now. He recommended I cooperate fully but carefully, answer questions but don't volunteer information, and let him handle all communication with detectives from now on. The media got hold of the story within 48 hours. Someone at the police department or maybe a neighbor who'd seen the police activity had tipped off the local news. Portland Tribune ran a story. Disturbing discovery in Northeast Portland home. Police investigating children's teeth found hidden in crawl space. They didn't name me, but included my address and enough details that anyone could figure out who owned the house. My phone exploded. Reporters calling for comments. Neighbors I'd never met knocking on my door with questions and concerns. Someone spray-painted child killer on my garage door overnight. I filed a police report about the vandalism, but they said they couldn't do much without witnesses or cameras. I installed security cameras that afternoon, covering every angle of my property. Started documenting everything, every suspicious car that drove by, every phone call from unknown numbers, every piece of hate mail that showed up. Because hate mail did show up. Letters calling me a monster, a predator, demanding I leave the neighborhood. Never mind that I hadn't done anything, that I was as horrified as anyone by what had been found. The court of public opinion had tried and convicted me based on geography alone. I stopped going outside except to get my mail. Started having groceries delivered. Worked from home because going into the office meant dealing with co-workers who'd seen the news and had questions. Liam called a week after finding the teeth. Said his wife Kelly had forbidden him from being around me until the investigation concluded. Said his kids had asked why Uncle Owen wasn't coming to their soccer games anymore, and he'd had to deflect. Said he wanted to believe me, but the whole thing was too disturbing to process. I asked if he really thought I could be responsible for harming children. He said he didn't know what to think, that the evidence was in my house, which made me connected whether I liked it or not. I told him I missed him and his family. He said he missed me too, but needed to protect his kids. We ended the call without resolving anything. That hurt worse than the media attention or the hate mail. Liam was my best friend, my only sibling, the person I'd counted on for everything. If he couldn't trust me, who would? I spiraled into depression for a few days. Barely ate, barely slept, just obsessively searched for information about Walter Kemp and those 3 missing children. Found that Kemp had worked as a maintenance supervisor for Portland Public Schools from 2004 to 2016. That detail made my blood run cold. He'd had access to children, to schools, to situations where he could have been around kids without suspicion. I called Detective Curtis immediately, told her what I'd found. She said they'd already discovered his employment history and were pursuing that line of investigation. She actually sounded less suspicious of me, more focused on Kemp as a suspect. That was something. The forensic results came back 3 weeks after the discovery. Detective Bowman called me directly, asked if I could come to the station for an interview. Lawrence Briggs insisted on accompanying me. We met at Central Precinct downtown, were led to an interview room that smelled like stale coffee and cleaning products. Bowman and Curtis laid out what they'd learned. The teeth belonged to at least 5 different children based on DNA analysis. Ages ranged from 6 to 11 based on dental development. The DNA didn't match any children currently in missing persons databases, which was both relieving and disturbing. Relieving because it meant these weren't from recently abducted children. Disturbing because it raised questions about who these children were and whether they were even reported missing. The teeth dated from different time periods based on the degradation and other markers. Earliest appeared to be from the early 2000s, latest from around 2015. All of this had happened during Walter Kemp's residence. They'd located Kemp living in Beaverton under a different name, had brought him in for questioning. He'd lawyered up immediately, but they had enough for a search warrant on his current residence. That search was happening today. Bowman asked if I'd noticed anything else unusual about the house during my time there. I mentioned the boxes of children's items I'd donated early on. Curtis asked if I remembered which Goodwill. I did, the one on Sandy Boulevard. They said they'd try to track down those donations, but after 6 months it was unlikely the items still existed. The search of Kemp's Beaverton apartment yielded enough evidence for an arrest. Detective Curtis called me 2 days later with an update. They'd found journals documenting his crimes going back to 2003. Found photographs of children, some of whom matched missing persons cases from years ago. Found more teeth hidden in his current residence. Found evidence linking him to at least 8 child abductions in the Portland metro area between 2005 and 2017. He'd been a serial predator operating for over a decade, using his position with the school district to access victims, keeping trophies from each one. The teeth in my crawlspace had been left behind when he'd fled the foreclosure, probably hidden in the panic of leaving quickly and forgotten in the chaos. Curtis said the DA was building a case for multiple counts of kidnapping, aggravated murder, abuse of a corpse, and other charges. Kemp would likely spend the rest of his life in prison if convicted. She also said I was officially cleared of any suspicion, that the timeline and evidence made clear I had no connection to the crimes beyond unfortunate circumstance of buying his former house. I felt relief so intense it made me dizzy, but the relief was complicated by horror at what had actually happened, at what had existed in my house without my knowledge, at the victims whose families would finally get answers. The media coverage shifted immediately, from man under investigation to homeowner discovers evidence of serial crimes. Reporters wanted interviews now to tell the story of how I'd innocently bought a house and uncovered a decade of horror. I declined all of them on Lawrence Briggs's advice. Didn't want to be the face of this story, didn't want my life defined by accidentally discovering someone else's crimes. The spray paint was cleaned off my garage by neighbors who showed up with apologies and cleaning supplies. The hate mail stopped. People who'd avoided me started reaching out with support and sympathy. But the damage to my relationship with Liam remained. I called him after I was officially cleared, told him the full story about Kemp and the evidence and the arrest. He said he was glad I'd been cleared but needed more time before we could resume normal contact. Said Kelly was still uncomfortable with the whole situation, still worried about exposing their kids to anything related to such horrific crimes. I understood, but it still hurt. We'd been close our whole lives, and one terrible discovery had fractured that relationship, maybe beyond repair. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Walter Kemp's trial became a major news event. The details that emerged during proceedings were sickening. He'd used his school position to identify vulnerable children, had groomed and abducted them systematically, had killed them and disposed of their bodies in remote locations. The teeth had been his trophies, his way of keeping pieces of his victims. Some of the children's remains were recovered based on information in his journals. Families who'd been searching for missing children for years finally got closure and bodies to bury. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I attended some of it, sitting in the back of the courtroom, needing to witness the justice being delivered, even though it brought me no comfort. Kemp showed no remorse, sat there blank-faced while victim impact statements were read, while evidence was presented, while his atrocities were detailed for the public record. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The judge sentenced him to 8 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. He'd die in prison, which was some measure of justice for families who'd lost children to his predation. I sold the house 6 months after Kemp's conviction. Couldn't live there anymore knowing what had happened within those walls, what had been hidden in the spaces I'd been renovating. A developer bought it, tore it down, and built a new construction townhouse on the lot. Sometimes bad history needs to be completely erased rather than renovated. I moved to a modern apartment in a different neighborhood, one with no history except being newly built. Started therapy with Dr. Raymond Foster, who specialized in trauma from indirect exposure to violence. He helped me process the guilt I felt for benefiting from lower house prices while not knowing the home's dark past, the horror of having lived unknowingly above evidence of murdered children, the isolation that had come from being suspected of crimes I hadn't committed. Dr. Foster said trauma doesn't require direct victimization. Sometimes just proximity to evil is enough to damage you. I'd been damaged by this experience, by the discovery and investigation and aftermath, but I'd also survived it and come through to the other side. That counted for something. Liam and I eventually reconciled, though it took over a year. He reached out after Kemp's conviction, apologized for doubting me, said he'd been wrong to pull away when I'd needed support. Said Kelly had finally understood that I'd been a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator. We started having coffee weekly, rebuilding the relationship slowly. His kids resumed calling me Uncle Owen, asking me to their games and recitals like nothing had changed. But something had changed. There was a wariness now that hadn't existed before, a recognition that terrible things could lurk beneath normal surfaces, that people you thought you knew could harbor dark secrets or be connected to them through no fault of their own. The innocence of our relationship before was gone, replaced by something more cautious, but maybe more honest too. We both knew now that proximity to evil was random, and anyone could become entangled in horror through nothing more than bad luck and timing. That knowledge changed everything, made us both more careful about assumptions and judgments, made Liam regret his initial reaction, made me understand why he'd been scared, made us both more intentional about maintaining connection despite how close we'd come to losing it. The families of Kemp's victims found some measure of closure through the trial and convictions. Several of them reached out to thank me for finding the teeth that had broken the case open, that had led to Kemp's arrest and the recovery of their children's remains. Those conversations were among the hardest I'd ever had. What do you say to parents whose children were murdered by a monster who'd kept pieces of them as trophies? I'd just been renovating my house and stumbled onto evidence. They'd been living in agony for years, searching and hoping and grieving. Their gratitude felt undeserved, but I accepted it because they needed to thank someone, and I was the closest available target. One mother, whose daughter had been missing since 2009, told me that knowing the truth was better than the uncertainty, even though the truth was horrible. At least now she could bury her child and know what had happened. That conversation stayed with me. Sometimes the worst truth is better than the best lie, better than years of not knowing, better than hope that slowly turns to despair. Kemp had stolen so much from these families, their children, their peace, their trust in the world. The least I could do was accept their thanks for accidentally uncovering evidence that gave them answers. 3 years after finding those teeth, I was living a completely different life. New apartment, rebuilt relationship with Liam, career progression at work that had nothing to do with the house or the discovery. The media had moved on to other stories. Walter Kemp rotted in prison, occasionally mentioned when new evidence was found or other cold cases were examined for potential connections. The families of his victims continued healing, however healing was possible after such loss. And I'd learned lessons I never wanted to learn about how random chance can entangle you in someone else's evil, how proximity to horror can damage you even when you're innocent, how quickly people can turn on you based on suspicion alone. I'd also learned that truth eventually prevails if you have patience and resources and the courage to face investigations honestly. That relationships strained by crisis can heal if both people are willing to do the work. That houses are just structures and can't make you culpable for crimes committed within them by previous occupants. Sometimes buying a house at below market value means inheriting more than just needed repairs. It means inheriting history and secrets and the burden of discovery. But that inheritance doesn't define you unless you let it. Walter Kemp's crimes happened in my house, but they weren't my crimes. The teeth were found in my crawl space, but they weren't my trophies. The investigation examined my life but found me innocent. And ultimately, that's what mattered. Not the suspicion or the horror or the terrible coincidence of buying the wrong house, but the truth that I'd stumbled onto evidence of evil and done the right thing by cooperating with authorities until justice was served. Sometimes that's all you can do when you find yourself accidentally connected to darkness. Cooperate, tell the truth, and wait for reality to overcome suspicion. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people who matter most eventually understand that proximity to evil doesn't make you evil. It just makes you unlucky enough to have been in the wrong place where terrible things once happened and left behind evidence that needed to be found. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.